A fist pounded on the door so hard that the wood cracked near the hinge. Elara Voss was awake before the second knock landed, her bare feet already on the cold floor, her hands already reaching for the basket of clean cloth she kept by her bed for nights exactly like this one. "Elara, open up please, open up now." The voice belonged to Finn, a boy of no more than 16, and it cracked with a fear she had heard only a few times before. She threw the door open and found him holding up his older cousin, a hunter named Garrick, whose shoulder was torn open and slick with dark blood that caught the moonlight and made it look almost black. "Table now," she said, and her voice did not shake, even though her heart hammered against her ribs. Finn dragged Garrick inside and laid him across the wooden table that Elara used for exactly this purpose, though she prayed every week that she would not need it. She lit the lamp with one quick strike of a match, and the small room filled with warm, trembling light. "Rogues," Finn said, breathless, backing against the wall. 3 of them, maybe 4, right at the tree line past the north field. They came out of nowhere. Garrick was checking the traps and they just came out of the dark. Elara did not answer. She was already cutting away the ruined shirt with her shears, already pressing clean cloth against the wound to slow the bleeding, already counting the rhythm of Garrick's breath to know how much time she had. This was not her first rogue attack. Mudridge Hollow sat close enough to the wild borderlands that every few months the peace was broken by wolves who had no pack, no law, and no mercy. The Hollow had no soldiers of its own, no walls, no one of any real power to protect it. It had only her, and her herbs, and her steady hands. "Hold him still," she told Finn, and he obeyed at once, gripping his cousin's good arm while Elara threaded a bone needle with thread she had boiled clean that very morning, as if some part of her had known she would need it. Garrick groaned, his eyes rolling back, and Elara leaned close to his ear. "You are not allowed to die on my table," she said quietly. "It would ruin the finish on the wood, and I only just sanded it smooth." It was a strange thing to say to a dying man, but Garrick's lips twitched, just barely, into something like a smile, and his breathing steadied. That was the trick Elara had learned from old Mira, the healer who raised her. Pain wants company, but it does not know what to do with laughter. Give a wounded man something small to hold on to, something human, and sometimes that is the thread that keeps him stitched to the world. She worked through the night. By the time the first gray light touched the hills outside her window, Garrick was sleeping, pale but breathing evenly, his shoulder bound tight beneath clean linen. Finn had fallen asleep in the corner chair, his head tipped back, exhaustion finally winning over fear. Elara washed the blood from her hands in a basin of cold water and allowed herself, for the first time in hours, to feel how tired she was. She stepped outside into the early morning, because the little house suddenly felt too small to hold the whole night inside it. The air smelled of wet grass and wood smoke, and somewhere a rooster was crowing without much conviction. The ground near her doorstep had turned to soft mud from the rain 2 nights before, and the village children were already up, chasing each other around the well despite the hour, despite the danger that had visited the Hollow only hours earlier. Children, she had noticed long ago, had a way of forgetting fear faster than anyone else. A little girl named Wren slipped in the mud and went down with a shriek that turned instantly into delighted laughter. 2 boys dove in after her, and within moments the 3 of them were rolling in the wet earth like it was the finest game ever invented. Elara felt the tightness in her chest loosen, just slightly, and before she understood what she was doing, she had crossed the yard and dropped down into the mud with them. "You are all going to catch a cold," she said, without a trace of real warning in her voice. "You caught it first," Wren said, pointing at Elara's own mud-streaked sleeve, and Elara laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere low in her chest and pushed the fear of the night clean out of her. She had not laughed like that in weeks. The Hollow had been tense since the first rogue sighting near the border, and tension had a way of pressing down on a person until they forgot that laughter was still allowed. She did not know that she was being watched from the tree line at the edge of the village by a man who had arrived at dawn on foot, his boots caked with days of travel, his cloak plain and unmarked, hiding far more than it revealed. The man stood very still, the way wolves do when something has caught their attention completely. He had come to Mudridge Hollow expecting to find fear, exhaustion, a village bracing for another attack. He had heard the rogue activity was worsening near this border, had come personally, quietly, without his usual guard, to see the truth of it with his own eyes rather than trust a report written by someone else's hand. Instead, he found a woman covered in mud up to her elbows, laughing so freely that it seemed to loosen something in his own chest, something that had been wound tight for longer than he cared to admit. He did not know her name yet. He only knew that he had traveled through 3 territories, sat through more councils than he could count, listened to 100 women arrange themselves like careful paintings in the hope of catching his eye, and none of them, not one, had ever looked like this. None of them had ever laughed with mud on their face and dirt under their nails and not seemed to care in the slightest who saw. He told himself it meant nothing. He was here for the rogues, for the border, for the safety of his people, not for a stranger playing in the mud with village children. And yet he found his feet carrying him a few steps closer before he caught himself, before the old habits of caution reminded him that a king who wandered too close to strangers, unguarded, was a king inviting trouble. Elara, meanwhile, had no idea that Mudridge Hollow's quiet morning held anyone new. She helped Wren to her feet, brushed uselessly at the mud on the girl's dress, and sent the children off toward their mothers with the promise that she would check on Garrick again before midday. As she stood, wiping her hands on her apron, something made her glance toward the tree line, the same instinct that told her when a storm was coming, or when a wound was about to turn bad beneath its bandages. She saw nothing but trees and morning mist. Whatever had been there, if anything had been there at all, was already gone. She shrugged the feeling off the way she shrugged off most things that could not be treated with herbs or thread, and turned back toward her little house, back toward Garrick's steady breathing and Finn's exhausted sleep, back toward the endless quiet work of holding a small, forgotten village together with nothing but her own 2 hands. She did not know that a king had just seen her laughing in the mud, and had already, without meaning to, begun to fall. The day moved on the way ordinary days did in the hollow. Elara checked on Garrick twice, changed his bandage, forced a cup of willow bark tea past his lips despite his complaints that it tasted like boiled dirt. She visited old Etta, whose knees ached worse with every change in weather, and left her a small jar of warming salve. She walked the edge of the village where the herb garden grew in careful rows, checking which plants needed water and which needed to be harvested before the next frost, because a healer without supplies was no healer at all, only a woman with good intentions and empty hands. It was quiet work, unglamorous work, the kind that no one thanked her for because no one really noticed it, not the way they noticed a hunter's kill or a farmer's harvest. But Elara had never wanted thanks. She had grown up watching Mira do this same work, day after day, year after year, without complaint, without asking for anything beyond what the village could spare. When Mira died 3 winters past, Elara had simply stepped into her place, the way a plant grows to fill whatever space is left empty beside it. By evening, word had spread through the hollow that a stranger had been seen near the North Road, a traveler, alone, asking quiet questions about the rogue attacks. Nolan, the village elder, mentioned it to Elara while she was closing up her small stock of dried herbs for the night. A traveler, this close to the border, alone, Nolan said, shaking his head. Either very brave or very foolish. Maybe both, Elara said, only half listening, her mind still on Garrick's wound, and whether the stitches would hold through the night. He didn't come into the village proper, just watched from the tree line for a while, then moved on toward the old mill road. Nolan scratched his beard. Strange thing to do. Watch a village, and then walk away without a word to anyone. Elara paused at that, some small prickle of memory surfacing, the sense she'd had that morning of being watched while she laughed in the mud with the children. She dismissed it just as quickly. Travelers passed through occasionally, drawn by rumors of cheap land near the border or simply lost on the wrong road. It meant nothing. If he comes back, send him to me if he needs anything, she told Nolan. No one should be turned away hungry, whatever business brought him here. Nolan chuckled. That's Mira's girl talking. She'd be proud of you, you know, keeping this place standing the way you do. Elara smiled, though the compliment sat a little heavy in her chest, the way compliments about Mira always did. She missed her teacher fiercely, in the quiet moments especially, when the house felt too silent, and the weight of the whole hollow's well-being rested on her shoulders alone. But she had learned long ago that grief and duty could sit side by side, that a person could carry both without breaking, as long as they kept their hands busy and their mind fixed on the next task in front of them. That night, after Finn had gone home and Garrick slept soundly with color returned to his face, Elara sat alone by her small fire and allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. She thought of the rogue attacks growing more frequent along the border, of the fear that had settled over the hollow like a fog that refused to lift. She thought of how alone the village truly was, how far from any real protection, how entirely dependent on her own small skills and whatever luck the hollow could scrape together. She did not think of the stranger at the tree line again that night. She had no way of knowing that he was thinking of her, sitting somewhere along the old mill road with a small fire of his own, turning over the image of a laughing, mud-streaked healer in his mind like a stone he could not put down. She did not know that her quiet, unnoticed life was about to change entirely. that the man who had watched her that morning carried more power in his blood than anyone in the hollow could imagine, and that his path and hers had already begun to bend toward each other, slowly, the way two rivers bend toward the same valley long before they ever meet. For now, she banked her fire, checked on her sleeping patient one final time, and went to bed with mud still faintly staining the hem of her sleeve, entirely unaware that somewhere out in the dark, a king could not stop thinking about the sound of her laughter. The old mill road was quiet, but Cale Ashgrave had learned long ago that quiet roads told their own kind of story, if a man knew how to read them. Broken branches at odd heights, a patch of grass pressed flat in a shape too large for any deer, the faint, sour smell of wolves who ran with no pack, no law, and no one to answer to. He crouched at the edge of the tree line, studying a set of tracks that led away from the north field toward the deeper forest, and felt the old, familiar tightening in his chest that came before trouble. He had left his court 3 days ago with only a single guard, a quiet, capable man named Bram, and had sent even him ahead on a separate path so that Cale himself could move through this border region unseen. Kings did not usually travel this way. Kings sent generals, sent scouts, sent reports written in careful, measured language that stripped all the danger out of a situation until it fit neatly on a page. But Cale had never fully trusted reports. He trusted his own eyes, his own nose, the particular quiet of a forest that had recently seen violence. And here, along this border, the quiet had teeth in it. 3 territories over, in his own fortress of dark stone and old pine, his council would be arguing right now about trade routes and marriage alliances, entirely unaware that their king was crouched in the mud examining rogue tracks like a common tracker. He almost smiled at the thought, almost. He had come to Mudridge Hollow expecting exactly what every report suggested. A small, frightened village clinging to survival at the edge of his territory, easy prey for the rogue wolves that had been growing bolder along the border for months now. What he had not expected was a woman laughing in the mud as though the whole world had not been threatening to fall apart around her only hours before. He straightened from his crouch, brushing dirt from his knees, and allowed himself, for the first time since arriving, to actually think about what he had seen that morning. It should not have affected him the way it did. He had seen 1,000 women in his life, women dressed in silk and jewels who curtsied and smiled and angled themselves carefully in his line of sight, hoping to catch the eye of the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories. None of them had ever made him feel anything close to what he'd felt watching a healer laugh with mud on her hands. It made no sense. He did not even know her name. Cale continued along the tree line until the forest thinned and gave way to a view of the hollow itself, small and unassuming, smoke curling from a handful of chimneys, the kind of place easily overlooked by anyone who measured worth in gold or soldiers. But he had learned, over years of ruling, that the small places often held the truest measure of a territory's health. A king who only visited his grand cities never truly understood his own kingdom. The border villages, the forgotten corners. These told him what his people actually endured, while his council debated policy in comfortable rooms. And what he saw in Mudridge Hollow troubled him. No proper fortifications. No trained fighters beyond a handful of hunters who knew the woods but had never been taught to face an organized attack. A single healer holding the whole place together with herbs and steady hands, apparently, from what he'd overheard among the villagers gathering water near the well that morning, without even the support of a proper healers' guild behind her. He should have walked away then. He had the information he needed. The border was undefended, the rogue activity was worsening, and something needed to be done before the situation turned into a true tragedy. He should have returned to Bram, sent word to his generals, arranged for a proper garrison to be stationed here before the season turned colder and rogue wolves grew desperate with hunger. Instead, he found himself walking toward the village itself, telling himself it was only to gather more information, only to understand the full scope of the danger, before deciding how to respond. He told himself this even as some quieter, more honest part of him understood that he simply wanted an excuse to see her again, to hear her voice, to understand what kind of woman laughed in the mud after a night that had clearly seen violence, if the fresh blood he'd noticed on a discarded cloth near the well was any indication. He reached the edge of the village as the sun climbed higher, and adjusted the plain gray cloak he wore over his clothes, the one without any mark of his house, without the silver wolf emblem that would have announced his identity to anyone with eyes to see it. He had worn plain clothes on quiet missions before, but never with quite this particular knot of nerve sitting in his stomach, a feeling so unfamiliar to him that it took him a moment to identify it correctly. He was nervous. Cale Ashgrave, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, feared by rogue packs and respected by rival houses alike, was nervous about walking into a small village to find a healer whose name he did not even know. It was almost funny, if he allowed himself to find it so. He found Nolan first, the village elder, sweeping the front step of a modest home near the well. Cale approached with the easy, unhurried posture he had practiced for exactly this kind of situation. A traveler passing through, nothing more. Nothing that would draw suspicion. "Good morning," Cale said. "I heard there was trouble here last night, rogues near the north field." Nolan looked up, taking in the stranger with the wary but not unfriendly assessment of a man used to travelers passing through on the old mill road. "Trouble enough. A young hunter was hurt bad, but our healer patched him up proper. She's good at what she does, that one." "Your healer," Cale repeated, careful to keep his voice light, unremarkable. "I imagine that's important work, this close to the border." "Important, don't begin to cover it," Nolan said, leaning on his broom. "Elara's kept this whole village breathing more times than I can count. Lost count of the wounds she's stitched, the fevers she's broken, the babies she's brought into the world with her own 2 hands. Her teacher trained her well before she passed, rest her soul, and Elara's carried that work alone ever since. Not that she'd ever ask for thanks for it." Elara. Cale turned the name over in his mind, the same way he'd turned over the memory of her laughter the night before, and found that it suited her exactly, though he could not have said why. "Sounds like a remarkable woman," Cale said. "That she is. Though don't go telling her I said so, she'll only wave it off and change the subject to something more useful, like whether the frost's coming early this year." Nolan chuckled, then studied Cale a moment longer. "You looking for healing yourself, stranger? You've got the look of a man who's traveled hard." It was, Cale realized, the perfect opening, one he had not even needed to invent himself. "As a matter of fact," he said, "I did take a fall on the road 2 days back. Nothing serious, but it's been troubling me since." "Well then, you're in luck. Her house is just past the well, the one with the herb garden along the side. Can't miss it, unless you're blind as an old mole." Nolan gestured with his broom toward a small, tidy house with neat rows of green plants growing along one wall. The same house Cale had watched from the tree line the morning before, though he did not mention that. "Thank you," Cale said, and meant it more than the simple words could carry. He walked toward Elara's house with his heart beating in a way it had not beaten before any battle, any council meeting, any negotiation with a rival house. He told himself again that this was only reconnaissance, only a king doing his due diligence to understand the true state of his border territories. He told himself this all the way up to her door, and did not believe a single word of it by the time he raised his hand to knock. The door opened before his knuckles ever touched the wood. Elara stood there, a basket of fresh-cut herbs balanced on her hip, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a faint, lingering trace of dried mud still clinging to the hem of her dress from the morning before. Up close, she was even more striking than she had seemed from a distance, her eyes a clear, sharp brown that studied him with open curiosity, rather than the careful deference he was used to receiving from strangers. "Can I help you?" she asked, and her voice carried no trace of the reverence he was accustomed to, no careful measuring of his worth or status. She looked at him simply as a stranger standing at her door, nothing more, nothing less. Cale found, to his own considerable surprise, that he had never been more grateful for anything in his life. "I hope so," he said. "I hurt my shoulder on the road a couple of days back. A fellow in the village mentioned you might be able to help." Elara's gaze sharpened slightly, assessing him now with a healer's practiced eye rather than mere curiosity, taking in the way he held himself, the small tells of pain or injury that she had learned to read over years of practice. "Which shoulder?" "The left," Cale said, choosing at random, and hoped she would not press too closely on details he had not thought to prepare. "Come in then," she said, stepping back to allow him entry. "Though I should warn you, my last patient nearly bled all over my good table last night, so if you're squeamish about a bit of clutter, you'll have to manage." "I think I can manage," Cale said, and found himself smiling, actually smiling, in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar and entirely welcome, as he stepped over her threshold and into a house that smelled of dried herbs and wood smoke, into a life that he could already feel, pulling him toward something he had never planned for, and had never wanted quite so much. Inside, the house was small but ordered, every jar and bundle of dried herb arranged with a purpose that spoke of years of careful practice. Garrick still slept in the corner bed, his breathing slow and even, and Elara kept her voice low as she gestured for Cale to sit at the table she had scrubbed clean that morning, the same table that had held a wounded hunter only hours before. "Shirt off, if you please," she said, matter of fact, already reaching for a small jar of salve. "I need to see the shoulder properly, not guess at it through fabric." Cale hesitated only a moment before complying, setting his cloak aside and pulling his shirt over his head with the careful economy of movement of a man used to hiding scars, though the scars he carried were not the kind she would recognize. Old fighting wounds, the marks of battles fought to secure his throne years before, crossed his shoulder and upper arm in faint white lines. He watched her eyes catch on them, and braced for questions he had not prepared answers for. "You've fought before," Elara said simply, running her fingers along one old scar with a professional detachment that surprised him. "More than once from the look of these." "A hazard of travel," Kale said carefully. She did not press further, which surprised him even more than the question itself would have. Most people, on noticing scars like these, wanted the story behind them, wanted to know what battle, what danger, what heroism or tragedy had left such marks. Elara simply pressed gently along his shoulder, testing for the injury he had claimed, her touch professional and impersonal in a way that felt strange after months of court where every touch carried some hidden meaning or calculation. "I don't feel anything unusual here," she said after a moment, frowning slightly. "No swelling, no heat, nothing that suggests a recent injury. Are you certain it's this shoulder?" Kale felt a flicker of something that might have been embarrassment, an unfamiliar sensation for a man rarely questioned by anyone. "Perhaps I exaggerated the severity," he admitted. "It's been a long few days of travel. Maybe I only imagined the injury was worse than it truly was." Elara studied him a moment longer, and Kale had the distinct, uncomfortable sensation of being seen far too clearly by a woman who had no idea who he actually was. "Or maybe," she said slowly, "you wanted an excuse to see the village healer, and a sore shoulder was the first thing that came to mind." Kale's mouth went dry. He had faced down rival alphas without flinching, had negotiated with cunning and dangerous men without losing his composure, and yet this woman, with her plain dress and her sharp, knowing eyes, had managed to unsettle him more thoroughly than any of them. "Would that be so terrible?" he asked, before he could stop himself. Something shifted in Elara's expression, not quite a smile, but something warmer than the professional mask she'd worn since opening her door. "Strange men wandering into my house under false pretenses isn't usually something I encourage," she said. "But I suppose, given the trouble we've had lately, I don't mind a bit of honest company for a change. Most people who visit me lately are either bleeding or worried about someone who is." "That sounds like a difficult way to live," Kale said quietly, meaning it more than the simple words conveyed. Elara shrugged, setting the salve jar back on its shelf. "It's necessary work. Someone has to do it, and I'm the one who knows how." She glanced toward Garrick's sleeping form, "especially with things the way they are near the border lately." "The rogue attacks," Kale said. "You've heard about them then." Elara's expression turned troubled. "They're getting worse, more frequent, bolder. A few months back it was just livestock going missing, the odd sighting near the tree line. Now we've had 2 attacks on people in as many weeks. Garrick there is lucky he's only lost blood and not his life." Kale felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over him, the one that never truly left regardless of how far he traveled from his own fortress. This was his territory, his people, his failure that this village had been left so exposed. "Has anyone sent word to the Alpha King's court about this?" he asked, careful to keep his voice neutral. Elara's laugh held no real humor in it. "Sent word, yes. Whether it reached anyone who cared enough to act on it, that's another matter entirely. Mudridge Hollow is small, out of the way, easy to forget when there are larger territories demanding attention. We've sent 3 separate reports over the past 2 months. As far as I know, they've all disappeared into whatever pile such things go to die in." The words landed like a blow, and Kale found himself gripping the edge of the table hard enough that his knuckles went pale. He had not seen those reports. He was certain of it, certain enough that the failure did not sit with him directly, but the knowledge did nothing to ease the anger building in his chest. Anger at whatever bureaucratic failure had allowed a village under his protection to be left defenseless for months, while rogue wolves grew bolder along its borders. "That seems like a serious oversight," he said carefully, forcing his voice to remain level. "It's more than an oversight when people are getting hurt," Elara said, and there was an edge in her voice now, tired and frustrated in equal measure. "I don't blame the king himself, exactly. I imagine he has larger territories, larger problems, than one small village most people have never heard of. But it would be nice, just once, to feel like Mudridge Hollow mattered to someone beyond the people who actually live here." Kale sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling over him uncomfortably. He had always believed himself a fair ruler, attentive to his territories, careful with the responsibilities his throne demanded of him. And yet here, in this small house, he was learning that his own carefulness had failed a village that needed him, had failed a woman who spent her days holding the wounded together, with nothing but her own 2 hands and whatever herbs she could grow along the side of her house. "I imagine," he said slowly, choosing his words with unusual care, "that if the king knew the full truth of what was happening here, he would want to help." Elara's expression softened slightly, though skepticism still lingered in her eyes. "Maybe. I've heard he's a fair man mostly, strict but fair. Though fairness doesn't count for much if the reports never reach him in the first place." "No," Cale agreed quietly, "it doesn't. He spent longer in her house than he had any reasonable excuse for, long after the pretense of the injured shoulder had been thoroughly abandoned by both of them. They talked of small things, the herb garden along the side of her house, the way she'd learned her craft from a woman she clearly still grieved, the particular stubbornness of Mudridge Hollow's people, who refused to abandon their homes despite the growing danger along the border. Cale found himself laughing more in that single afternoon than he had in months at his own court, found himself drawn into easy, honest conversation with a woman who had no idea he held her entire territory's fate in his hands. When he finally rose to leave, the afternoon light slanting long and gold through her small window, Elara walked him to the door with the same easy familiarity she might have shown any patient, though something in her eyes suggested she had enjoyed the visit rather more than her professional duties strictly required. "Well, traveler," she said, "I hope your shoulder, real or imagined, gives you no further trouble." "I have a feeling," Cale said, "that I'll need to return and have it checked again, just to be certain." Elara's mouth curved into something that was almost, but not quite, a genuine smile. "I suppose I can't stop you from worrying unnecessarily about your own health. Though next time, you might consider simply saying you wanted to talk, rather than inventing an injury to justify it." "Duly noted," Cale said, and stepped back out into the golden afternoon, his mind already turning over every word of their conversation, every small detail of her house, her garden, her tired, honest frustration about a village left forgotten by the very throne meant to protect it. He walked back toward the tree line where Bram waited, his mind no longer occupied solely with rogue tracks and border security, though those concerns had only grown more urgent in his mind since learning of the ignored reports. Now his thoughts carried an additional weight, a woman with sharp brown eyes and a laugh that had undone something in him he had not even known was tightly wound, a woman who had no idea that the stranger she'd just treated held the power to change everything about her village's fate, and who Cale found, with each passing hour, that he wanted very much to know better, whatever complications that desire might eventually bring. Bram was waiting exactly where Cale had left him, seated on a fallen log at the edge of the forest with the patient stillness of a man who had served his king long enough to know better than to ask unnecessary questions. He rose as Cale approached, taking in his king's expression with the sharp attentiveness of long practice. "You were gone longer than expected," Bram said carefully. "The situation here is worse than the report suggested," Cale said, deciding to address the more pressing matter first, the one that would not wait for personal considerations. 3 separate warnings were sent to court over the past 2 months. None of them reached me. Bram's jaw tightened. "That's a serious failure, if true." "It's true. I heard it directly from someone with no reason to lie about it." Cale's voice had gone hard, the easy warmth of the afternoon replaced by the cold focus of a ruler assessing a genuine threat to his territory. "Send word back to the fortress tonight. I want to know exactly where those reports went missing, and I want a proper garrison arranged for this border before the week is finished, whatever the cost." "Understood." Bram hesitated, studying his king with the careful attention of a man who had known him long enough to notice small changes. "And the woman? The one you went to see?" Cale did not answer immediately, and that silence told Bram more than any words could have. "She's the village healer," Cale said eventually. "Elara. She has no idea who I actually am." "Do you intend to tell her?" It was a fair question, and Cale found he did not have a ready answer for it. Telling her would mean the end of whatever easy, honest connection had grown between them in that small house that afternoon, would transform him instantly, from a curious traveler, into the Alpha King, a title that came with weight and distance, and the careful deference that had made every other woman he'd met treat him like a prize to be won, rather than a man to be known. He was not ready to lose that, not yet, not when he had only just found it. "Not yet," Cale said finally. "I need to understand the full scope of this rogue threat first. There will be time enough for the rest of it later." Bram said nothing further, though the look he gave his king suggested he understood far more than Cale had actually said aloud. Over the following days, Cale found reasons to return to Mudridge Hollow that had nothing at all to do with rogue investigations, though he told himself otherwise each time. He brought Elara small gifts disguised as simple gratitude, a jar of honey from a hive he'd found along the road, a bundle of rare healing herbs he'd noticed growing near a stream 2 territories over, Each visit stretched longer than the last, filled with easy conversation, and the particular comfort of a connection built on nothing but honesty, or at least honesty on one side of the exchange. Ilara, for her part, found herself looking forward to his visits with a warmth that unsettled her when she examined it too closely. She had never been a woman inclined toward romantic distraction, had built her entire life around her work, around the steady, necessary rhythm of caring for a village that depended on her. And yet something about this quiet traveler, with his careful eyes and his dry, unexpected humor, had settled into her days in a way she had not invited but found herself unwilling to push away. "You ask a great many questions for a simple traveler," she observed one afternoon, nearly a week into his visits, as she worked dried herbs into neat bundles for winter storage, while Kale sat nearby. Ostensibly helping, though, his contribution mostly consisted of handing her things she had not actually requested. "I'm naturally curious," Kale said, which was true enough, though it did not begin to cover the full truth of his interest. "Curious about a small border village that most travelers pass straight through without a second glance," Ilara said, not quite a question, her sharp eyes studying him in a way that made him distinctly aware of how much he was not saying. "You ask about the rogue attacks like a man planning a response, not like a man simply passing through and pitying our misfortune." Kale felt the familiar tension of a conversation drifting too close to truths he was not yet ready to reveal. "Perhaps I simply have more sympathy than most travelers," he said carefully. "Perhaps," Ilara said, though her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. She set down the bundle of herbs she'd been tying and studied him more directly. "You carry yourself strangely, for a traveler. You give orders without meaning to. That man who came through last week, the one asking about the northern road, he addressed you like he was reporting to someone in charge, not chatting with a stranger." Kale's stomach tightened. He had been careless, he realized, allowing Bram to check in with him too openly during a brief visit through the village, forgetting that Ilara's sharp mind missed very little. "He mistook me for someone else, perhaps," Kale offered, though even to his own ears the excuse sounded thin. Ilara did not press further, though the skepticism in her expression lingered, a small crack in the easy warmth that had grown between them, a crack that Kale knew, with a growing sense of dread, would only widen the longer he continued to hide the truth from her. He told himself he would explain everything soon, once the rogue threat had been properly addressed, once he understood how to reveal his identity without losing the honest connection that had become, in these short weeks, one of the few genuinely uncomplicated joys in his entire life. But the border had other plans for his timeline. Reports reached him within days that the rogue activity had grown bolder still, no longer content with isolated attacks on hunters or livestock, but organizing in ways that suggested something more deliberate than the usual desperate chaos of wolves without a pack. Bram brought the news to him at their camp along the mill road, his expression grim in the firelight. "Scouts have confirmed at least a dozen rogues operating together in this region," Bram said. "That's far more organized than typical rogue behavior. Someone is leading them, coordinating their movements." "A rogue alpha," Kale said, the pieces settling into place with the particular clarity that came from years of dealing with exactly this kind of threat. Someone with enough strength and cunning to unite wolves who would otherwise never cooperate. "It would explain the pattern of attacks," Bram agreed, testing the village's defenses, probing for weaknesses, growing bolder with each success. "If they're planning something larger, Mudridge Hollow won't survive an organized assault. They have no walls, no trained defenders beyond a handful of hunters." Kale's jaw tightened at the thought. An image of Ilara caught in the middle of exactly the kind of violence she spent her days trying to mend rising unbidden in his mind. How long until they're ready to move against the village directly? Difficult to say with certainty. Days, perhaps. A week at most if the pattern holds. "Then we don't have time to waste on caution," Kale said, rising to his feet with the decisive energy of a man who had found his purpose sharpened by fear for someone he had, against every reasonable expectation, come to care for deeply in a matter of weeks. "Send for the garrison immediately. I want soldiers stationed at Mudridge Hollow before the week is finished. Whatever arrangements need to be disrupted to make it happen." "And the woman?" Bram asked quietly. "You'll need to reveal your identity soon, if soldiers are marching into her village under your banner." Kale closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the choice settle over him. He had wanted more time, wanted to build something honest and uncomplicated before the truth of his identity inevitably changed everything between them. But some choices were no longer his alone to make, not when a village full of people, and one woman in particular whose laughter had undone something carefully guarded in his chest, stood in the path of a growing and organized danger. "Yes," he said finally, the word heavy in his mouth. "It's time she knew the truth, whatever it costs me." He did not yet know how quickly, and how painfully that reckoning would arrive. The attack came at dusk, faster and more violent than anyone in Mudridge Hollow had expected, even after weeks of growing fear. Elara had been walking home from checking on old Edda's aching knees when the first howl split the evening air, followed almost immediately by shouts of alarm from the direction of the north field. She broke into a run without a second thought, her basket of supplies clutched tight against her chest, years of instinct driving her feet toward danger rather than away from it. Because someone would need her hands soon. Someone always did. She reached the edge of the village square just as 3 rogue wolves burst from the tree line, their eyes wild and their movements coordinated in a way that made her blood run cold. This was not the chaotic, opportunistic violence of desperate lone wolves. This was organized, deliberate, and far more dangerous than anything the Hollow had faced before. Villagers scattered in every direction, screaming, grabbing children, running for whatever shelter their homes could provide. Elara pressed herself against the side of a building, her mind racing through what little she could do against wolves rather than wounds, when a fourth figure emerged from the chaos, moving with a speed and controlled power that made every other movement in the square look clumsy by comparison. It was Cale, but it was not the quiet, curious traveler she had come to know over the past weeks. This man moved with absolute authority, his voice cutting through the chaos with a command that made even the rogue wolves hesitate for the briefest instant. "Fall back to the center of the village," he shouted, and villagers who had never met him before found themselves obeying instantly, some deep instinct recognizing the voice of true alpha power, even before their conscious minds understood what they were hearing. Cale moved between 2 of the rogue wolves with a speed that seemed almost impossible, his own transformation beginning at the edges, features sharpening, strength surging through his frame in a way that spoke of power far beyond any ordinary wolf. Elara watched, frozen against the wall, as the traveler she had shared quiet afternoons with, the man who had asked careful questions and handed her herb bundles with clumsy, endearing uncertainty, fought with a ferocity and skill that marked him as something far greater than he had ever let her believe. The battle was over quickly once Cale fully engaged, his strength overwhelming the rogues in a way that left no doubt about the true gap in power between them. 2 of the rogues fled back into the tree line, wounded and unwilling to continue a fight they could not win. The third lay motionless in the mud, and Cale straightened from the fight, breathing hard, the last traces of his shifted features receding back into the face Elara had come to know so well over these past weeks. Villagers who had scattered in fear now emerged cautiously, staring at the stranger who had just single-handedly driven off an organized rogue attack, murmuring among themselves with growing recognition and awe. Nolan pushed through the gathering crowd, his eyes wide. "That's the mark of the Northern House," he said, staring at the faint silver pattern that had emerged along Cale's forearm during the fight, a mark of rank that only the highest bloodlines carried. "That's the king's own mark." The words rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped into still water, and Elara felt something cold settle in her stomach, as understanding crashed over her all at once. The careful questions about the reports, the strange way he carried himself, the man who had addressed him with the deference of someone reporting to authority rather than chatting with a friend, all of it clicked into place with a clarity that made her feel foolish for not seeing it sooner. "You're the Alpha King," she said, and her voice carried across the suddenly quiet square, flat and hollow, with a betrayal she had not expected to feel so sharply. Cale turned to face her, and whatever relief or triumph he might have felt at driving off the rogue attack drained instantly from his expression at the sight of her face. "Elara," he said, taking a step toward her. "Don't," she said, backing away, her arms wrapping instinctively around herself, as though she could hold together the pieces of something that had just cracked wide open. "Don't come any closer. Just tell me the truth, all of it, right now." Cale stopped where he stood, understanding that he had lost, in this single moment, something he had spent weeks carefully building. "I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories," he said quietly, the words heavy with an apology he did not yet know how to properly voice. "I came here investigating the rogue attacks along the border. I saw you that first morning, laughing with the children, and He stopped, unsure how to continue without sounding like he was making excuses for a deception that clearly deserved none. "You lied to me," Elara said, and her voice shook now, betraying the hurt beneath the anger. "Every conversation, every visit, you let me believe you were just some traveler, just some ordinary man asking simple questions, while the whole time you were—" She gestured helplessly at him, at the silver mark still faintly visible on his forearm, at the crowd of villagers watching the scene unfold with a mixture of shock and fascination. "You let me talk about the king like he was some distant, uncaring figure who couldn't be bothered to help us, and you just sat there and let me say it, knowing the whole time that you were him. I was going to tell you, Kale said. Though even as the words left his mouth, he understood how weak they sounded against the weight of weeks of deception. I wanted to, more than once. I only wanted— What did you want? Elara's voice cracked, and for the first time since the rogue attack had begun, she looked less angry than simply exhausted, worn down by a betrayal she had not seen coming from a man she had let herself trust, more than she'd trusted anyone in years. Some kind of game? Some way to see how the common people really live before you go back to your court and forget all about us? No, Kale said, and something in his voice, raw and unguarded in a way she had not heard from him before. I wanted, for once in my life, to be seen as just a man, not a title, not a crown, not a position that every single person I meet tries to use for their own advantage. You looked at me like I was ordinary, and it was the most honest thing anyone had given me in years. Elara stared at him, the anger in her chest warring with something softer, something that ached at the raw honesty in his voice even as it recognized the fundamental unfairness of the situation, the way he had taken something honest from her without ever offering the same honesty in return. That doesn't excuse the lie, she said finally, quieter now. You had weeks to tell me the truth, weeks where I trusted you, where I let myself believe we were building something real, and it turns out none of it was real at all, not on your side, because you never let me see who you actually were. It was real, Kale said, taking a step closer despite her earlier warning, unable to stop himself. Everything I said to you, everything I felt sitting in your house, laughing with you, that was real. Only the title was hidden, nothing else. Elara shook her head slowly, stepping back before he could close the distance further. I need time, she said. I need to understand what just happened here, and I can't do that with you standing in front of me looking at me like that. She glanced past him at the rogue wolf still lying in the mud, at the frightened villagers slowly emerging from their homes, at the reality of a threat that had just proven far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The village needs help. Real help, soldiers, proper defenses. I understand that now, better than I did an hour ago. But I can't. She stopped, pressing her hand briefly against her own chest as though trying to hold something together by force. I can't look at you right now without feeling like a fool. She turned and walked away before Kale could find any response adequate to the moment, disappearing into the gathering crowd of villagers who parted for her with the automatic deference of people who trusted their healer completely, even as they stared at the king who had just revealed himself in their midst, with a mixture of awe and uncertainty that mirrored Elara's own tangled feelings exactly. Kale watched her go, the victory of driving off the rogue attack turning to ash in his mouth, understanding with painful clarity that he had just lost something far more valuable than he had ever properly appreciated until the exact moment it slipped through his fingers. The days following the attack passed in a strange, uneasy rhythm for Mudridge Hollow. True to Kale's word, a small garrison of soldiers arrived within 3 days, setting up proper watch positions along the tree line and beginning the slow work of fortifying the village against future assaults. The villagers, still absorbing the shock of learning their quiet traveler had been the Alpha King all along, treated the soldiers with a mixture of relief and lingering wariness, uncertain how to process a sudden influx of royal attention after months of feeling entirely forgotten. Elara buried herself in work, the way she always did when her own feelings grew too complicated to examine directly. She treated the soldiers for minor injuries sustained during their fortification efforts, checked on Garrick's healing shoulder, tended her herb garden with a fierce, focused attention that left little room for thoughts of silver marks or careful lies told across weeks of easy conversation. She did not visit the small camp where Kale had established himself at the edge of the village, and he, to his credit, did not press her. Though she caught glimpses of him occasionally, directing soldiers with the same natural authority she had briefly mistaken for simple confidence, before understanding it as the deeply ingrained habit of a man born to command. You've been quiet, Nolan observed one evening, finding her sitting alone outside her house as the sun set, her hands still for once instead of busy with some task or another. I have a lot to think about, Elara said, which was true enough without addressing the tangle of hurt and confusion and, despite everything, lingering warmth that sat uncomfortably in her chest whenever she thought of Kale. He's not a bad man, Nolan said carefully, settling onto the step beside her. Whatever else you might think of him right now, the soldiers he sent, the fortifications going up, that's more real help than this village has seen in longer than I can remember. Whatever his reasons for the lie, the results speak for themselves. That doesn't make the lie hurt any less, Elara said quietly. No, Nolan agreed. I imagine it doesn't, but sometimes the reasons behind a mistake matter more than we give them credit for, once the sting has faded enough to think clearly about them. Elara did not answer, though Nolan's words settled somewhere in her chest, alongside all the other tangled feelings she had not yet found the energy to properly examine. 3 territories away, in his own fortress of dark stone and ancient pine, Cale found himself facing a different but equally uncomfortable reckoning. His council, upon learning of his extended absence and the personal risk he had taken traveling to the border alone, had grown increasingly vocal about matters they felt required his immediate attention. The alliance with House Pharaoh requires your response within the week, his chief advisor, a sharp-eyed woman named Odessa, informed him during a council session that felt, to Cale, considerably less important than the fortification work still ongoing at Mudridge Hollow. Their daughter would make an excellent political match, and the territory needs the stability that alliance would provide, particularly given the instability we've seen along the northern border. I'm aware of the political benefits of the alliance, Cale said, though his mind was clearly elsewhere, a fact that Odessa noted with the sharp attention of someone who had served him long enough to recognize distraction when she saw it. You've seemed distracted since your return from the border, my king, Odessa observed carefully. Is there something regarding the rogue situation that requires further attention? The rogue situation is being handled, Cale said. The garrison I've sent should stabilize the immediate threat while we investigate the source of the coordination among those wolves. Then what troubles you? Odessa pressed, and Cale found himself unwilling to answer honestly, unwilling to explain that the true source of his distraction was a healer in a small border village who likely wanted nothing more to do with him after the way he had deceived her. Nothing that concerns the council's business, Cale said finally, and Odessa, recognizing the closed door in his tone, did not press further, though her expression suggested she filed the observation away for later consideration. The council session continued around discussions of trade routes and territorial boundaries, but Cale found his attention drifting again and again to thoughts of Ilara, to the memory of her face in the moment she'd learned the truth, the raw hurt in her expression that had cut deeper than any blade he'd faced in actual combat. He had faced down rival alphas, had negotiated with treacherous houses, had commanded armies in defense of his territory, and none of it had prepared him for the particular ache of disappointing someone whose good opinion had come to matter more than he'd ever expected it to. That night, alone in his private chambers, Cale found himself staring at the small jar of honey still sitting on his desk, the twin of the one he'd given Ilara during one of their early visits, purchased on impulse from the same roadside hive because he'd wanted, in some small way, to share something of their easy connection with himself, even while away from her company. The gesture felt foolish now, sentimental in a way he was unaccustomed to indulging. He thought of what Odessa had said about House Pharaoh's daughter, about the political stability such an alliance would provide, about the practical, sensible logic of choosing a mate based on territorial advantage rather than the messy, complicated pull of genuine feeling. It was the choice a wise king would make, the choice his advisors expected, the choice that generations of rulers before him had made without apparent regret. And yet the thought of it left him feeling hollow in a way that political considerations alone could not explain. He thought instead of Ilara's laughter echoing across a muddy village square, of her sharp, unimpressed assessment of his scars, of the easy honesty that had grown between them before his deception had poisoned it. He thought of how she had looked at him, in those weeks before the truth came out, not as a king or a title or a political opportunity, but simply as a man worth knowing for his own sake. He did not know if such a thing could be salvaged after the hurt he had caused. He did not know if Ilara would ever look at him again without that flash of betrayal darkening her sharp brown eyes. But he found, sitting alone in chambers grown suddenly too large and too quiet, that he was unwilling to simply let the possibility go without attempting, however imperfectly, to make things right. The following morning, he summoned Bram and gave instructions that had nothing to do with rogue investigations or garrison logistics. I need to return to Mudridge Hollow, he said, not as a king addressing a political matter, but as myself. I owe someone there an apology that political duties have delayed long enough. Bram studied him for a long moment before nodding, understanding more than Cale had explicitly said. And House Pharaoh's proposal? We'll have to wait, Cale said, until I've settled matters closer to my own heart first. He did not yet know whether his return would be welcomed, or whether the growing rogue threat along the border would give him the chance to make things right before circumstances forced his hand entirely. But he knew, with a certainty that surprised him in its intensity, that he could not simply move forward with his life, political or otherwise, without first attempting to repair what his careful deception had broken. The scream that woke Mudridge Hollow before dawn belonged to a sentry positioned along the north field, and it cut off with an abruptness that told everyone within earshot exactly how serious the danger truly was. Ilara was awake instantly, her healer's instincts recognizing the particular quality of that silence. the sound of violence that had already claimed its first victim. She dressed quickly, gathering her supplies with the practiced speed of someone who had done this too many times before, and stepped outside to find the entire village already in chaotic motion. Soldiers from the garrison were shouting orders, forming defensive lines at the village edge, while villagers scrambled to gather children and elderly relatives toward the center of the settlement where the newly constructed defensive wall offered the greatest protection. "How many?" Elara asked a passing soldier, a young man whose face had gone pale with fear despite his training. "More than we've seen before," he said, breathless. "Dozens, maybe. They came from multiple directions at once, like they knew exactly where our weak points were." Elara's stomach dropped at the implication. This was not a desperate, disorganized assault. This was a coordinated attack, planned with knowledge of the village's defenses that suggested either careful scouting, or, more troublingly, some kind of betrayal from within. She moved toward the village center, setting up a makeshift treatment station in the sturdy stone building that served as Mudridge Hollow's meeting hall, the same building where Nolan had once presided over minor disputes and harvest celebrations, now transformed into a place where she expected to spend the coming hours fighting to keep people alive. The first wounded arrived within minutes, a soldier with claw marks tearing across his side, carried by two of his fellow garrison members with the particular grim efficiency of men who had faced this kind of violence before. Elara worked without pause, her hands moving through the familiar motions of cleaning, stitching, stabilizing, while outside the sounds of battle grew louder and more desperate. "The rogues are pushing hard at the eastern perimeter," one of the wounded soldiers reported between gritted teeth as Elara worked on his injuries. "There's someone leading them, a big wolf, dark coat, moves like he knows exactly what he's doing. Our garrison commander thinks it's the same rogue Alpha that's been coordinating attacks along the whole border." The name meant nothing to Elara directly, but the implication settled heavily in her chest. This was not simply an isolated attack on a forgotten border village. This was something larger, something deliberate, and Mudridge Hollow, small and unprepared despite the recent fortifications, sat squarely in the middle of it. She continued working through what felt like hours, though she lost proper track of time entirely, focused entirely on the endless stream of wounded that came through the meeting hall's doors. Finn appeared at some point, helping carry supplies, his young face set with a determination that reminded her painfully of how quickly this war had forced children in the Hollow to grow up faster than they should have needed to. "The wall's holding," Finn reported during a brief lull, "but barely. The garrison commander sent word to the fortress for reinforcements, but no one knows how long it'll take them to arrive." Elara nodded, too exhausted and focused to spare much thought for reinforcements that might not come in time regardless. She had learned long ago to focus on what was directly in front of her, the wound she could treat, the life she could save in this exact moment, rather than losing herself in fears about outcomes she could not control. A commotion at the meeting hall's entrance drew her attention, and she looked up to see two soldiers carrying a third between them, his uniform torn and bloodied in a way that made her chest tighten with immediate professional alarm. As they laid him on the nearest clear space, she recognized him as one of the garrison's senior officers, a man named Corwin who had been overseeing the eastern perimeter defenses. "Rogue got through the line," one of the soldiers explained urgently, as Elara began assessing the wound. Deep claw marks across his chest that had torn dangerously close to vital organs. "We're losing ground out there. Whoever's leading these rogues. He's not just organized. He's smart. He's found every weakness in our defenses like he already knew where to look." Elara worked quickly, her hands steady despite the growing dread building in her chest with each new piece of information. If the rogue leader truly knew the village's defensive weaknesses in such precise detail, it suggested a level of planning and inside knowledge that went beyond simple opportunistic violence. Someone, somewhere, had provided information that no ordinary rogue wolf should have possessed. "We need the king," Corwin managed to say through gritted teeth as Elara pressed clean cloth hard against his wound, trying to slow the bleeding enough to properly close it. "This is beyond what our garrison alone can handle. If he doesn't come, personally, with real reinforcements, this village won't survive the week." The words hit Elara harder than she expected, the mention of Kale cutting through her focused professional detachment and reminding her, with unwelcome clarity, of everything that remained unresolved between them. Whatever hurt and betrayal she still carried from his deception, the practical truth of the situation was undeniable. Mudridge Hollow needed help beyond what a single garrison could provide, and the only man with the power to provide that help was the very king she had been avoiding since the truth of his identity had come out. She finished stabilizing Corwin's wound and moved immediately to the next patient, forcing her personal feelings aside in favor of the more immediate work of keeping people alive. But even as her hands moved through familiar, practiced motions, Some part of her mind kept circling back to the same uncomfortable question. Would Kale come? If word reached him of how desperate the situation had truly become, and if he did, would she be able to set aside her own hurt long enough to accept whatever help he offered? The battle outside raged on through the morning, the sounds of violence occasionally punctuated by moments of eerie quiet that felt somehow more unsettling than the chaos itself. Word filtered through to the meeting hall in fragments, carried by wounded soldiers and frightened villagers seeking shelter. The eastern wall had been breached and reclaimed twice already. The rogue leader seemed to be probing for a final, decisive weakness before committing to a full assault, and the garrison, brave as they were, could not hold indefinitely against an enemy who appeared to understand their defenses as thoroughly as they did themselves. Alara worked until her hands ached and her vision blurred with exhaustion, treating wound after wound, holding steady for patients who needed her calm more than they needed her words. And beneath all of it, a single thought persisted, quiet but unshakable. Whatever had broken between herself and Kale, whatever hurt, still lingered from his careful deception. None of it mattered as much as the survival of the village she had spent her entire life protecting. If he came, she would set aside her own feelings long enough to accept whatever help he could offer. The Hollow's survival demanded nothing less. Whatever personal reckoning still waited to be settled between them once the immediate danger had passed. She did not yet know that word of the attack had already reached him, or that he was already moving toward the border with a speed that defied every careful political consideration his council had urged upon him, driven by a fear for her safety that outweighed every other concern in his mind entirely. The messenger arrived at Kale's fortress just past midday, half collapsed from the hard ride, gasping out his report before he had even fully caught his breath. Mudridge Hollow is under heavy assault, my king. The garrison is holding, but barely. The rogue leader is organized, coordinated, and pushing harder than anything we anticipated. Commander Corwin requests immediate reinforcement, or he fears the village will fall by nightfall. Kale was already moving before the messenger finished speaking, shouting orders to assemble every available fighter, his mind narrowing to a single, sharp point of focus that had nothing to do with strategy or politics, and everything to do with a woman whose safety mattered to him more than he had properly understood until this exact moment. Odessa intercepted him in the fortress courtyard as he prepared to depart, her expression carefully composed despite the obvious alarm beneath it. My king, I understand the urgency, but riding out personally, without proper preparation, without a full accounting of the threat you're facing, this is not the measured response the situation requires. Send your generals, send the full force of the Northern Legion if necessary, but your presence on the border, unprotected, invites exactly the kind of risk your council has warned against. The council can debate the wisdom of my choices after the village has been saved, Kale said, his voice carrying an edge of command that left no room for further argument. I'm not sending soldiers to die in my place while I remain safely behind these walls, debating strategy with men who have never seen the true cost of these attacks firsthand. This isn't only about strategy, Odessa pressed, matching his pace as he crossed the courtyard toward the waiting horses. There are already whispers among the houses about a king, distracted by matters unbecoming his position. A common healer in a forgotten border village, my king. This is not the kind of personal entanglement that strengthens your standing among the territories who watch for exactly this kind of weakness. Kale stopped and turned to face her fully, his expression hard in a way that made even his most trusted advisor take an involuntary step back. Let them whisper, he said. A king who cannot be moved to protect his own people, whatever their standing, whatever their position, is not a king worth the crown he wears. I built this territory on the principle that every person within its borders deserves protection, not only the houses with political weight to throw around. If defending a small village and the woman who has spent her entire life holding it together costs me some political capital among houses, more concerned with appearances than actual duty, then I will gladly pay that price. Odessa held his gaze for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, the careful political calculation giving way to something more like reluctant respect. Then I will manage the political fallout here, my king, while you handle the more immediate crisis. Go, but return safely, whatever else happens. The territory needs its king alive, far more than it needs him proving a point on a distant battlefield. Kale nodded once, already turning back toward his waiting horse, Bram falling into step beside him with the quiet efficiency of a man who had anticipated exactly this outcome from the moment the messenger's report reached them. You heard all of that, Kale said as they mounted, not quite a question. I did, Bram said simply. For what it's worth, my king, I think you're making the right choice, whatever the political cost. It doesn't feel like much of a choice at all, Kale admitted, urging his horse forward. the fortress gates opening ahead of them onto the long road that would carry him back toward the border, back toward a village he had come to care for more deeply than he had ever expected, and a woman whose safety had become, somewhere in the past weeks, more important to him than any political consideration his council could raise against it. They rode hard through the afternoon and into the evening, changing horses at 2 separate waypoints to maintain their pace, Cale's mind consumed entirely by fear for what might already have happened by the time they arrived. He thought of Ilara's sharp eyes, her steady hands, the particular courage she carried in caring for others even when the danger around her grew overwhelming. He thought of the possibility that his delay, his weeks of hesitation about revealing his identity, his failure to properly address the border's defenses sooner, might have contributed to a danger she now faced without him there to help. The guilt sat heavy alongside the fear, but Cale forced both aside in favor of the singular focus that had carried him through every battle of his life. Reach the village, assess the threat, and do whatever was necessary to ensure everyone there survived the night, regardless of personal cost. They reached the outskirts of Mudridge Hollow as darkness fell fully across the border region, the sounds of ongoing battle audible even before they crested the final ridge that would reveal the village itself. Cale's chest tightened at the sight that greeted them. Fires burning at multiple points along the village perimeter, the defensive wall clearly breached in at least 2 locations, and the unmistakable chaos of desperate, close combat, visible even from this distance. "They're barely holding," Bram said grimly, assessing the scene with the practiced eye of a longtime soldier. "Then we don't waste another moment," Cale said, already urging his horse forward down the ridge, his own transformation beginning at the edges even as he moved, the full weight of his alpha strength surging forward in response to the danger ahead. Whatever political costs awaited him, whatever consequences his advisors feared from this choice, none of it mattered against the singular, overwhelming need to reach the village in time, to ensure that Ilara and everyone she had spent her life protecting survived whatever remained of this desperate, violent night. He rode into the chaos of the battle with a speed and fury that startled even his own soldiers, cutting through the rogue lines with the full force of his true strength, finally unleashed without restraint, driven by a fear and determination that outweighed every careful political consideration that had governed his choices for so many years, before this single, desperate night changed everything about how he understood his own priorities. Ilara had run out of clean cloth twice already, forced to tear strips from her own spare clothing to keep pace with the endless stream of wounded still arriving at the meeting hall. Her arms ached, her eyes burned with exhaustion, and somewhere outside the walls of her makeshift treatment station, the sounds of battle had grown so loud and constant that she had stopped flinching at each individual crash and scream, her mind narrowing entirely to the immediate task of keeping the person in front of her alive. A young soldier burst through the door, his face streaked with blood that was not entirely his own. "The eastern wall has fallen completely," he gasped out. "The rogue leader is pushing straight through toward the village center. Commander Corwin's ordered everyone who can still fight to fall back and defend the meeting hall directly. This is our last line." The words sent a cold wave of fear through the room, wounded soldiers struggling to rise despite injuries that should have kept them still, villagers gathering whatever makeshift weapons they could find, farming tools and kitchen knives entirely inadequate against wolves who had already proven capable of tearing through trained soldiers. Ilara felt the fear settle deep in her chest, not for herself, but for Finn, still helping carry supplies despite her repeated instructions that he should shelter with the younger children, for Ren, and the other little ones huddled in the hall's furthest corner, for every person in this village who had trusted her to hold their community together, and who now faced a danger she had no herbs or steady hands to properly treat. "Everyone who can still stand, to the door," she called out, her own voice carrying a command she had not known she possessed until this exact moment of desperate necessity. "We hold here as long as we can." The rogue wolves broke through into the village center only minutes later, their numbers still overwhelming despite the losses they had clearly suffered throughout the long day of fighting. Ilara found herself pushed toward the meeting hall's rear exit along with the other non-combatants, herded by exhausted soldiers who understood that the wounded and the healers needed to survive this battle even if the fighters themselves did not. She stumbled out into the muddy clearing behind the hall, the same clearing she realized with a strange, disconnected clarity, where she had once laughed with village children in the soft earth after a night of similar violence, the very spot where Cale had first seen her, though she had no way of knowing that particular truth in this moment of pure survival instinct. A rogue wolf broke away from the main fighting and lunged toward the fleeing group, and Ilara found herself directly in its path, her feet slipping in the mud as she tried to scramble backward, her mind flashing with the sudden, terrible clarity that came before violence claimed a person entirely. She saw the wolf's dark eyes, felt the ground give way beneath her as she fell backward into the mud, and braced for an impact that never came. Kale appeared between her and the rogue wolf with a speed that seemed to defy the very laws that governed ordinary movement, his own transformed strength meeting the rogue's lunge with a force that sent both wolves crashing sideways, away from Alara, into the churned mud of the clearing. The fight that followed was brutal and fast, Kale's fury given full expression in a way Alara had never witnessed before. Every ounce of fear he had carried on the long ride to reach the village channeled now into the singular purpose of ending this threat before it could claim anyone else. The rogue wolf did not survive the encounter. Kale straightened from the fight, breathing hard, blood mixing with mud along his side where the rogue's claws had caught him before he'd fully gained the advantage, and turned immediately toward where Alara still sat in the mud, staring up at him with an expression that held equal parts shock and something that looked, despite everything that had passed between them, remarkably like relief. "Are you hurt?" Kale asked, dropping to his knees beside her in the mud without any apparent concern for his own wounds, his hands moving over her carefully, checking for injuries with an urgency that went far beyond simple professional concern. "I'm fine," Alara said, though her voice shook slightly with the aftermath of fear. "You're bleeding." "It's not serious," Kale said, though the wound along his side suggested otherwise, and Alara's healer instincts kicked in almost automatically despite everything, her hands moving to assess the damage even as the sounds of battle continued somewhere behind them, the rogue forces clearly breaking under the combined weight of Kale's arrival and the garrison's renewed defense. "Let me see that properly," she said, and Kale allowed her to examine the wound, sitting together in the mud of the same clearing where their strange, complicated connection had first quietly begun weeks before, though neither of them spoke of that particular symmetry in this exhausted, adrenaline-charged moment. "I came as soon as I heard," Kale said quietly, as Alara worked to stem the bleeding with what remained of the clean cloth in her supply bag. "I should have come sooner. I should have addressed the border's defenses the moment I learned how badly they had been neglected, instead of allowing weeks to pass while I—" He stopped, unsure how to finish the thought without sounding like he was making excuses again. "While you what?" Alara asked, not looking up from her work, though something in her tone suggested she genuinely wanted to hear the answer this time, rather than dismissing it as she had in the heat of her earlier anger. "While I told myself I needed more time to understand the threat properly," Kale said, "when the truth is, I was afraid of losing what had grown between us, if I revealed the truth too soon. I let my own selfish desire to be seen as just a man, rather than a king, delay decisions that should have come faster, decisions that might have prevented some of what happened here tonight." Alara's hands paused briefly in their work, and she looked up at him properly for the first time since he'd knelt beside her in the mud. "That's not entirely fair to yourself," she said slowly. "The rogue leader's coordination, the inside knowledge of our defenses, that's not something you could have simply prevented by revealing your identity a few weeks earlier. Whatever else is true, that failure doesn't belong entirely to you." "Perhaps not entirely," Kale agreed, "but my hesitation cost you trust you deserve to have from the very beginning. I fell for you before I ever properly earned the right to, watching you laugh in this exact mud with the village children, long before I understood you as anything beyond a woman who seemed entirely unlike anyone I'd ever met at court. And then I spent weeks building something real between us while hiding the one truth that mattered most, because I was too afraid of losing the honest way you looked at me to risk telling you sooner." Alara sat back slightly, the cloth still pressed against his wound, studying his face in the flickering light of the fire still burning at the village edge, the sounds of battle finally beginning to fade, as the last of the rogue forces retreated or fell, before the combined defense of soldiers and their king. "You fell for me," she repeated slowly, "before you ever saved me." "Long before," Kale confirmed. "That first morning, watching you covered in mud, laughing like the whole world hadn't just tried to hurt the people you love. I didn't understand it then, not fully. But I understand it now, sitting here, having very nearly lost the chance to ever tell you properly." The clearing around them had grown quieter, the immediate danger clearly past, though the aftermath of the battle would take considerable time yet to properly address. Alara looked at the man kneeling in the mud beside her, wounded and exhausted, and entirely without the careful authority he'd carried into this fight only minutes before, and found that whatever hurt still lingered from his earlier deception had softened, in this moment, into something more complicated and considerably warmer than simple anger. "I'm still angry with you," she said, though her voice carried none of the sharp edge it had held during their confrontation days before. "The lie still matters. But I think," she added, glancing around at the clearing, at the mud that had witnessed both the beginning of their strange connection and now this raw, honest reckoning, "I think I understand A little better than I did. Why you made the choice you did. That doesn't excuse it entirely, but it helps. Kale reached out, carefully, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, and when she did not, he took her hand in his, mud-streaked and steady despite everything. I don't expect forgiveness tonight, he said, but I intend to spend however long it takes earning it properly, if you'll allow me the chance. Elara looked down at their joined hands, at the mud covering them both, at the village behind them slowly emerging from chaos into the difficult work of recovery, and felt something settle in her chest that she had not expected to feel again after the betrayal of learning his true identity. I think, she said slowly, that I'd like to see you try. 3 months brought remarkable change to Mudridge Hollow. Where broken walls had once marked the aftermath of that terrible night, sturdy new fortifications now stood, built with proper stone and reinforced timber under the direction of engineers Kale had sent from his own fortress, along with a permanent garrison large enough to ensure the village would never again face an organized threat without adequate defense. The investigation into the rogue leader's inside knowledge had eventually traced back to a corrupt border official who had been selling information for coin, a betrayal Kale had dealt with swiftly and thoroughly once uncovered, ensuring no similar failure would endanger his territories again. Elara had watched the village slowly heal alongside its physical wounds, the fear that had gripped Mudridge Hollow for so many months gradually giving way to a cautious, hard-won sense of safety. Garrick's shoulder had healed completely, strong enough now that he'd returned to hunting the northern woods with his usual confidence. Ren and the other children had reclaimed their games around the well, their laughter no longer tinged with the underlying anxiety that had shadowed the village during the worst of the rogue attacks. And Kale had kept his promise, returning to Mudridge Hollow as often as his duties allowed, each visit rebuilding, patiently and honestly, the trust his earlier deception had damaged. He told her everything now, without reservation, the full weight of his responsibilities, the political pressures his council continued to raise, the complicated realities of ruling a territory as vast and demanding as the Northern Territories. And Elara, in turn, found herself trusting him more fully with each honest conversation, understanding gradually that the man she had first met laughing over a false injury in her small house had never truly been separate from the king who now shared his real burdens with her as freely as he once shared simple curiosity about her herb garden. Your council still isn't pleased about this, Elara observed one afternoon, sitting beside Kale in the same herb garden where their friendship had first properly taken root, watching him attempt, with limited success, to help her separate seedlings without crushing their delicate roots. My council will adjust, Kale said, his focus entirely on the small plant in his clumsy hands, rather than any political concern. Odessa has come around considerably since Mudridge Hollow's successful defense. Even she admits now that a king willing to ride personally into danger for people others considered beneath his notice speaks rather well of his character, whatever complications it creates for traditional political alliances. And House Pharaoh's daughter? Elara asked, a teasing note entering her voice despite the genuine curiosity beneath it. House Pharaoh has found a different alliance to pursue, Kale said, one considerably less complicated than a king who had already, quite thoroughly, lost his heart to someone else entirely before their proposal ever reached him. Elara smiled at that, setting aside the seedlings to study him properly. You know, she said, when Nolan first told me a stranger had been seen watching the village from the tree line, I never imagined it would lead to any of this. Nor did I, Kale admitted. I came to Mudridge Hollow investigating rogue attacks, expecting nothing more than another difficult border assessment. Instead, I found a woman covered in mud, laughing like she hadn't a care in the world despite everything the night before had cost her village, and I understood, almost immediately, that I had found something considerably more valuable than any political report could have prepared me for. Word had spread through the Northern Territories in the months since the battle at Mudridge Hollow, the story of the king who had ridden personally into danger to protect a small border village, and the healer who had won his heart there becoming something of a legend among the common people. Whatever complicated whispers still circulated among the more traditional houses, Kale had made no secret of his intentions, formally announcing at his own court, weeks after the battle, that Elara Voss would stand beside him not as a political arrangement, but as his chosen mate, a declaration that had scandalized some of the older houses, even as it had earned him considerable goodwill among the ordinary people who made up the true strength of his territory. Elara had struggled, initially, with the weight of what such a position would mean, the formal presentations at court, the expectations that came with standing beside a king in the eyes of an entire territory. But Kale had been patient, had never once asked her to abandon the work that had defined her entire life, arranging instead for Mudridge Hollow to maintain a properly staffed healer's house under her continued guidance, along with resources to train additional healers who might one day help carry the burden she had shouldered alone for so many years. "I won't stop being a healer," she had told him plainly, during one of their earliest honest conversations about what a future together might actually look like. "Whatever else this means, whatever position I might hold beside you, I won't abandon the work that made me who I am." "I would never ask you to," Cale had answered, and he had meant it fully, understanding by then that the very qualities that had first drawn him to her, the steady competence, the fierce dedication to people others considered too small or too forgotten to matter, were exactly the qualities he wanted standing beside him as he continued to rule, qualities that would make him, he hoped, a better and more attentive king than he might otherwise have become. Now, on this quiet afternoon in the herb garden, with the village rebuilt and thriving around them, Ilara found herself glancing toward the same muddy clearing behind the old meeting hall, the spot where children still occasionally played after a rain, where she had first laughed freely enough to catch the attention of a king she hadn't yet known existed, and where, months later, that same king had knelt beside her in the aftermath of violence and told her, with complete honesty at last, exactly how deeply he had fallen for her. "Come on," she said, rising and pulling Cale up alongside her, ignoring his confused protest about the half-finished seedlings. "Where are we going?" "You'll see," Ilara said, leading him across the garden toward the clearing, where a light rain overnight had left the ground soft and inviting in exactly the way it had been on that first morning so many months before. Cale understood the moment they reached the clearing's edge, watching Ilara step deliberately into the soft mud with the same easy freedom she had shown that very first morning he'd watched her from the tree line, laughing without a trace of self-consciousness as her feet sank into the wet earth. "This is where you saw me," she said, extending her hand toward him. "Before any of the rest of it, before the lies, before the battle, before any of the complicated things that came between us. Just this, a healer, laughing in the mud, entirely unaware that a king was watching." Cale took her offered hand and stepped into the mud beside her without a moment's hesitation, feeling the cool, soft earth beneath his own boots, the same ground that had witnessed the true beginning of everything that mattered most to him now. "And now?" he asked. "Now," Ilara said, laughing again, the same rich, unguarded sound that had first caught his attention months before. "You don't have to hide who you are to stand here with me. You can just be a man, laughing in the mud with a healer who happens to love him, without any secrets left between us." Cale laughed too, a sound as unguarded and genuine as her own, and pulled her closer in the soft, muddy clearing that had somehow become the truest, most honest place either of them had ever known. Around them, the village continued its quiet, rebuilt rhythm, children's voices carrying from somewhere near the well, smoke rising steadily from chimneys that no longer feared the coming of night, a small border settlement that had once felt forgotten by the world, now standing firmly under the protection of a king who had learned, in the most unexpected way possible, exactly what it meant to truly see and be seen by another person. And in that muddy clearing, with laughter still echoing between them, Ilara Voss, the quiet healer who had spent her life caring for others without asking for recognition, and Cale Ashgrave, the Alpha King who had fallen for her laughter long before he ever raised a hand to save her, found together the one thing that neither title nor duty nor any careful deception could ever properly replace: a love built, at last, on complete and unguarded honesty, standing exactly where it had first, quietly, begun.